Enzyme linked immunosorbent assay or ELISA. The basic principle of ELISA is to use an enzyme to detect the binding of antigen and antibody. The enzyme converts a colorless substrate chromogen to a colored product indicating the presence of antigen antibody binding. An ELISA can be used to detect either the presence of antibody or antigen in the sample depending on how the test is designed. Antibody detection. If the test is designed to detect antibody in a sample, combine antigen and antibody allow them to bind. Antigen is firmly attached to the surface, usually a plastic well or filter. Sample being tested is added, allowed to incubate, then unbound antibodies are washed from the surface. Detect antigen antibody binding and antiglobulin C comment that is covalently attached to an enzyme linked is added, allowed to incubate, then unbound antiglobulin are washed from the surface. A colorless substrate of the enzyme is added. If the enzyme linked antiglobulin bound to the antibody on the surface, the enzyme will convert the colorless substrate to a colored product. ELISA to detect antibodies, the reagent, and this is a positive sample, the negative sample. Here is the reagent, enzyme labeled by antibody, specific for the antibody, allow time to react, wash away bound antibodies, and the reagent colorless substrate for the enzyme. Positive substrate converted to colored product. Antigen detection if the test is designed to detect antigen in the sample, combine antigen antibody, allow them to bind. An antibody that reacts with antigen is firmly attached to the surface. Sample being tested is added, allowed to incubate, detect antigen antibody binding. Second antibody that react with the antigen and that is covalently attached to an enzyme linked is added, allowed to incubate, then unbound. The enzyme linked antibodies are washed from the surface. A colorless substrate of the enzyme is added. If the enzyme linked antibody bound to antigen on the surface, the enzyme will convert the colorless substrate to a colored product. Here is the steps, the reagents, and this is the positive result. Substance converts to colored. Competitive ELISA. The competitive ELISA is a variation of ELISA that detect antibody in the sample. It's based on the principle that antibody in the sample will bind to an antigen and then inhibit binding of an enzyme linked antibodies that react with the antigen, compete for binding. Combine antigen and antibody, allow them to bind. The antigen is firmly attached to the surface, usually plastic well or filter. The sample being tested is added and allowed to incubate, detect antigen antibody binding, and an enzyme linked antibodies that react with the antigen is added, allowed to incubate, then pushed from the surface. Colorless substrate of the enzyme is added. A colorless substrate of the enzyme is added. If the sample contain antibodies that react with the antigen, they would inhibit binding of the enzyme labeled antibody, and no color reaction would occur. If the sample doesn't contain antibodies that react with the antigen, the enzyme labeled antibody would bind and the color reaction would occur. Note that in the competitive ELISA, no color reaction is a positive result and a color reaction is a negative result. And this is the competitive ELISA reagent and the positive negative.